This lesson is about internal communications, and that's an area of public relations that students usually don't realize is part of the job often. In fact, you often think of PR as only externally focused, but certainly you can do internal communications plans. So what does internal mean? Well, internal means inside your organization, and that might be your company, or it might be your organization, or even your university. So let's say employees, that might be employees of, I'm trying to think of a national company, employees of General Motors, or members of an organization. So there are plenty of national organizations. For example, physical therapists have a national organization. And then certainly at a university or other school, the students are an important internal public. Now there's one thing to remember about this type of PR. There's a tool that we use in almost every other type of PR that we wouldn't use here. Can you think of what it would be? Well, it would be mass media. Because if you have an internal public, you don't need to rely on the mass media to give them information. You already know how to find those people. Now, the exception would be students at a university or school. So if you have a school newspaper or other mass media at the school, then of course you would incorporate that as part of your internal campaign. But for example, to reach Ole Miss students, you wouldn't send out a national news release. You would only send it to the school's media, such as the Daily Mississippian, Newswatch, Rebel Radio. Also, community PR is another lesson we'll do later, and it seems like it would be internal, but because it's not within one organization, community PR is a separate category. Now, why would you communicate internally? Well, several reasons. So whether you work at a big company or a national organization or a university, you still are going to practice those 3 A's. And remember, the first A is awareness. So you want to make people aware of what is happening in the organization. What is happening they might need to know about. Has someone gotten an award or an honor? Has someone been promoted? Or is there a new hire? Is there a change in policy? So for example, at Ole Miss, we certainly had parking changes a few years ago and continue to have them. And sometimes there's a problem coming. So unfortunately, sometimes layoffs might be in the future, and you're going to have to communicate with your internal public about that. Now, I don't know of any layoffs at Ole Miss, but I do know of a very good communications plan the Ole Miss PR department did about the parking changes. And you can't access these links from within your lecture, but I'm going to put them on Blackboard, and they made some really cute short videos to get the target public's attention, and that's faculty, staff, and students at Ole Miss, about the parking changes. And it was a great example of an internal communications. Some other internal communications we have at Ole Miss, there's a newsletter called Inside Ole Miss, and it is a weekly digital newsletter, and it only goes to faculty and staff. And it's kind of a summary of what's happening that week that we as faculty and staff would like to know about it. So here's a page from the most recent one, and you all know by now who this gentleman is, Mr. Harold Burson. Was inducted into the, and that should be SPRF. They misunderstood what SPRF, Southern Public Relations Federation, is, but he was inducted into their Hall of Fame recently. Okay. All right, we talked about the A, awareness. Remember, the second A is attitude. You might be trying to influence attitude of your members, your students, your employees. Maybe there's a policy change coming up and you want them to think positively, not negatively about that. Maybe there's a change in the employee benefits or retirement plan, or as we've mentioned at Ole Miss, parking, or maybe you're going to change work schedules. So what do you need to let them know about and hopefully get a positive attitude about? Now, as I'm recording this, there's been a great example recently. In Canton, Mississippi, there's a large Nissan factory, and the union has come in and attempted to organize a union of the workers there. And of course, the union members have been actively trying to recruit the employees to vote to unionize. But Nissan administrators have been actively trying to influence their workers to not unionize and influence their attitude. Both have been trying to influence the attitude of those workers. And it just happened this weekend, as I'm recording it, they took the vote, and Nissan's administration, apparently their efforts to persuade the employees worked because the workers did not vote in favor of the union. And what's the third A? Action. So maybe you want to get members of your organization or employees or students to take or stop an action. So for example, Ole Miss a few years ago implemented the no smoking on campus policy. And we had to communicate that to everyone so they would know that smoking is not allowed on campus. Other actions, of course, parking. You now can't park in certain locations, and the communications campaign was to make people stop or start that action. Now, one of your texts says that employees, members, and it doesn't mention students, but let's include students too, are the very first public of any organization. What does that mean, the first public? Why would they say that? Well, think about it. If your internal publics are not satisfied, how can you satisfy external publics? So let's think about employees. If an employee is happy working at that business, then the employee is much likely to be a better employee and make better products or offer better services. And employees are the public face of your organization, even a nonprofit. So if you, for example, want to go adopt a dog from the animal shelter, you're going to meet the workers at that shelter. They're the public face of that shelter. If you want to go eat at a restaurant chain, you're going to meet the server or the manager or the person who seats you, and they are representatives of that restaurant chain. So the first encounter people will have, usually with your business, is with one of your employees. And if you have happy employees, you're certainly going to have happier customers. As you go further in this lesson, you'll be looking at and reading about information about Southwest Airlines. And they work so hard to create a happy atmosphere for their employees. And in return, those employees are able to give better service to their customers. Now, a few other things that I know are pretty self-evident, but your book points out that if your employees are happy at work, they're less likely to miss work. They're likely to be more productive at work and not be standing around complaining most of the time. And they're likely to make fewer errors and be more efficient because they care about where they work. And if you can get your employees to care about your employer, that's going to make a huge difference. Think about, for example, have you ever perhaps been to a restaurant where a couple of the servers had called in sick that night, and so one or two servers are trying to take care of everyone in the restaurant? Well, it makes the whole restaurant look bad because they can't adequately take care of all the customers. All right, we've talked about employees, but let's talk about members. So members of an organization and students at a university, without those, you don't have an organization. So what if all of you students got tired of something at the University of Mississippi and left to go elsewhere? Well, what would we have left? Very little. What if members of an organization get disgruntled and leave? Well, then you don't have much of an organization left. And organizations particularly have to have a lot of members because that's what pays them. Dues are paid. So I put a link to the American Bar Association dues page if you want to look at it. But generally, I looked up a lawyer who's been admitted to the bar in 2007 or earlier pays almost $500 a year in dues to the American Bar Association. So if you lose a lot of those members who are paying almost $500 a year, you've lost the money you use for operating expenses. Now, Public Relations Society of America, you've heard of them. Well, they charge right at $300 a year, last I checked. So if a lot of PR pros do not join the organization or leave, that's a lot of money they don't have. And then they can't hire a communications person to communicate with their internal publics. And one thing your book mentions, and it's a good point, is that you as a public relations person might be working with the Human Resources Department. And most of you probably haven't worked at a larger corporation yet, but Human Resources is the office that will oversee your hiring and your benefits, and if you last that long, your retirement and or your firing. So you might first work to help recruit employees. And then certainly once they're on the job, you see the stars by that one, because that's by far the most important. Communicating with workers on the job. You might even help write a training manual for employees, for new employees. You certainly will be part of giving rewards and recognition to outstanding employees and communicating about it. And if it is a unionized place and they go on strike, or if the company has to lay off people, then you're going to be involved in communicating that. Now, the book also lists some rules of effective internal communication. And look at the first rule and put a star by it in your notes, because this is important. Tell your internal public first before you make an external announcement. You don't want your employees turning on the news and learning that their factory is going to be closed. You want them to know that first. That actually happened in Oxford a few years ago. We had a factory called Whirlpool, and in fact, that's why the Whirlpool trails are called that. You may not know that, but it's located right across from where the trails are. And they had to close. And so they called together their employees, I believe there were almost 700, and told them first. Then they told the local media about it. And that was absolutely the right way to do it. Another thing to remember is tell your employees good news and bad news. Because if you don't tell the bad news, everyone's going to start hearing rumors and worry about it and stand around and talk about what everyone's heard. And it's better to just be upfront about it. Be timely, of course. Don't wait till the very last minute to make an announcement. If you are going to close your factory, all those people have to find new jobs, and they need time and notice to do that. Find out from your employees two things. What do they want to know from the administration, and what method of communication do they prefer? So there's so many ways you could communicate with employees, and we'll talk about some of those, but find out what your employees prefer. Now, according to your book, when someone surveyed employees, these were their top 5 topics that employees wanted to be communicated to about from their administration. And certainly number 1 was that organization's plans for the future. Are they going to expand? Are they going to relocate? Are they going to downsize? Employees always want to know what's coming in the future and what does it mean for them. Second, they want to know how can they advance in that job? What promotion opportunities are there? And then you see, I won't read to you the other 3, 4, and 5. Now, you may be thinking the best way to communicate with employees is email. And certainly Ole Miss communicates with our faculty and staff often via email. But when employees, not at Ole Miss, but anywhere, are asked to rate how effective email is, you see they'd only give it about a 55% effectiveness rating because they say it just gets overwhelming. So maybe every different department is sending out an email and your inbox just gets cluttered with them. And I think what employees most prefer might surprise you, and that's just plain face-to-face. They'd rather have their supervisor or manager tell them something directly than have to go sorting through a bunch of emails. Now, of course, as the PR person, you would not be involved in that, but you will be involved when there has to be an employee newsletter or flyer or perhaps even a meeting. So let's look at the RACE, the Research, Actions, Communications, Evaluations. So let's say you've been hired at a large company. You've been hired at Coca-Cola, General Motors, Procter & Gamble, whatever the company may be. And you've been told one of your primary duties is internal communications. Well, there's some things you need to research. How many employees are we talking about? Are we talking about at one location or around the country? So, for example, FedEx has multiple locations around the world. Find out what communication method is being used right now, and is it working? And is that what employees prefer? Do they read or watch or listen to the communications? Have there been any previous campaigns to reach the internal public? And if so, what was the result of that? Also find out their demographics, because your employees are going to come from many different walks of life, most probably. And you want to find out what the majority of employees come from demographically and psychographically. And you also want to research their opinion. Just do a survey. What is their opinion on current policies and on their employer? Okay. Same thing with members of an organization. Now, I mentioned the American Bar Association. I mentioned there's an association for physical therapists. There's an association for doctors, the AMA. There's an association for pretty much every profession, including PR, which is PRSA. And so, similar to employees, you probably have different types of people according to what that organization is. So, for example, if it's the American Medical Association, you know everyone who belongs is a doctor, but how many are men and how many are women, and how many are in each race, and how many are young doctors right out of school, and how many are doctors who practice for 20 years. So you want to find out those kind of things about your members. Just like employees, you want to measure your members' opinions. So what do they think of the organization? Do they get what their dues are buying them? Do they feel their dues are worth it? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And like with employees, what are the current ways they're being communicated with? And is that what they prefer? So let's think employees for a minute, and let's use Ole Miss as an example. So at the University of Mississippi, of course, you have faculty members. And faculty members, many of them have PhD degrees, a few of them have master's degrees, so they're very educated public. You also have staff members. Now, staff members might have PhDs. For example, a chancellor or a vice chancellor, they likely have a PhD. But your staff can range from the chancellor and the head of the graduate school to the university lawyer, the university architect, the university landscape coordinator, and think about the landscape crew. Think about the varied kind of people who are working on the landscape and keeping our campus beautiful. So you have multiple kinds of employees. You also have clerical personnel, so secretarial staff and office administrators. You have people who clean the buildings and keep our buildings clean, the housekeeping staff. So right here at the University of Mississippi, we have layer on layer of types of employees. And some have indoor jobs and some have outdoor jobs. So how are you going to communicate with people whose main job is working outdoors, for example, keeping the landscaping beautiful? They're not sitting at a computer reading email every day. Okay. Second reason to research, as we've already mentioned, is find out what your employees or your members or your students' opinions on whatever the topic is. So for example, maybe your company is thinking of relocating its main office to another city. Well, survey your employees and see what they think about that. Do they hate it or do they love that idea? A third reason to research is once you've found out what your employees want or need, start getting the facts on it. So maybe you found out the employees are not happy with the food at the cafeteria. So maybe you could start having the Human Resources Department research new cafeteria options. Or maybe you found out that they would prefer to work 12-hour shifts 4 days a week instead of 8-hour shifts 5 days a week. And maybe you want to start finding some information on that. So what would some of your objectives be? Well, of course, as we've already mentioned, the first kind of awareness objective would be to increase awareness of a new policy or development at the company. Second type would be to increase positive perception by your employees of that new policy. And third, the action, to get employees to act in a certain way. So here are just some examples I totally made up. These are not real, but maybe you want to make your company employees aware of the new choices that are going to be available in the cafeteria. And you want to increase the number of employees who know that by 20%. Now, you've made them aware, but you want to increase positive perception. So there's your second one, increase positive perception of the employees of the new choices in the cafeteria. And what about action? There's your third one, to increase the number of company employees who eat in the cafeteria by 20%. There's your action one. For members, it'd be very similar. So first, your first level of objective would be to increase their awareness, increase their knowledge of the organization and its policies or developments. Second, you want to increase positive opinion towards that organization, perhaps increase positive opinion for a new program, or perhaps get them to take a certain action, maybe vote a certain way in an election. Now, tactics for an internal public differ a good bit from tactics for external publics because you have, if it's a company, you have employees there on site. However, if it's a national organization like the American Medical Association, those members are spread throughout the country. So you can't just gather them in one room very easily. So let's talk about first if your internal public is in one location. So all the employees at the University of Mississippi, or all the students at the University of Mississippi, or all the employees at Baptist Hospital in Oxford. How could you gather them together? What events or actions could you take? Certainly you could have a training seminar or call a meeting of all employees. You could, instead of just a regular meeting, turn it into a party or a reception or provide lunch or dinner for all the employees. A great idea is to have an awards ceremony. So one thing about awards is they don't have to exist. You can make them up and give them. So come up with an Employee of the Week award and present it each week. Anniversary observation. So either employee anniversaries when the employees have been there a certain number of years, or when your organization is a certain number of years old. Now at the University of Mississippi, they really very nicely commend employees when they've been here 25 years or longer. And that's any employee. So faculty, staff, no matter what your level, if you've been here 25 years or longer, Ole Miss recognizes you. And you get a plaque, and you get your picture made, and you get invited to a very nice luncheon. Another thing Ole Miss does is Staff Appreciation Day. And that's usually in the summer, and they'll have picnics and games for staff members to attend. And you might even have a contest among employees, like who can wear the craziest outfit or who can sing karaoke the best. But if your public is not all in one location, if you're a national or organization, the most typical way you gather members together is at a convention. So journalists will go to journalist conventions, PR people go to PR conventions, and those conventions might be national or regional. For example, we have the Southern Public Relations Federation we mentioned earlier, and each year they have a meeting of the PR members from around the South. Here in Mississippi, as you probably know, we have PRAM, the Public Relations Association of Mississippi, and each year they have a state conference for all the PR pros in Mississippi. At that convention, you could offer seminars, and that's very common. When you go to a convention, there are all sorts of seminars with speakers on topics related to your profession. An increasing benefit, however, is a webinar, and this would be where you don't actually even have to travel to the conference. You can watch a webcast once you join an organization. So for example, PRSA offers multiple webcasts for its members, helping them enhance their skills. All right, so we've talked about research and actions. Let's talk about communications. Now, mostly these are all controlled communications, meaning you control them from beginning to end. Because you're not relying on mass media, you don't have to wait for media to pick up your story to tell your internal public. If you do send out a news release or video to mass media, that's usually about an employee. It's not directed to the employee. So if you're at an organization like a university, you can just use some old school kind of methods. You can put up a bulletin board that people walk by every day. You can set up an exhibit or a display. Now, if people are still getting a paper paycheck, just stick something in the envelope with their paycheck. Many people now get their paycheck direct deposited. But if not, if they still have a paper paycheck, you can just stick something in their envelope with it. You may have internal television or video. So you may have training programs playing on the video cameras where you work. You might get a brochure or an employee handbook to help you. Intranet. You probably know what intranet is because you're on it at Ole Miss, My Ole Miss. Only you students can access the student parts of it. Only faculty and staff can access their parts of it. But it's a way to communicate with each other. Good old direct mail. So you don't have to mail the letter, but you could hand out a letter to each employee. And a really common way, put a star by this one, is newsletters. So remember I showed you Inside Ole Miss. That's a weekly newsletter that goes to employees. A newsletter is not a news release. A newsletter is a regular publication that goes to members of an organization. Think about some other ways you could communicate with your local public. You could put flyers around campus or around your building where you work. And if you've thought about it before, in the University of Mississippi, often there's a banner hanging in front of the Union or around the Grove announcing upcoming events. Now, how do you communicate with members of an organization? Well, of course, email is a great way. But just like we said before, email inboxes get pretty cluttered. And that may not be the best way to communicate with your employees, or your members. If you belong to an organization, you too often have an access to an intranet. So, for example, as a member of PRSA, I can access things on their site that non-members cannot. We've already mentioned newsletters. And if you join an association, often they publish brochures you can hand out to clients. So the American Dental Association, for example, publishes a lot of brochures that dentists who belong to them can then hand out to their patients. Another way you can get your members together is at group meetings, and certainly texting would be a way. So I've listed here the American Medical Association. This is what the blurb for their newsletter. So if you are a physician and you join the American Medical Association, this is where you would go to get your news. Now, another organization locally is the Oxford Chamber of Commerce. And the Chamber of Commerce is an organization where about 600 business owners and business leaders have joined together. How does the chamber director communicate with the members? Through a newsletter. And I'm going to put a link on Blackboard for you so you can see the newsletter that goes to members. Finally, how do you evaluate? Well, this is not quite as important and internal as it is in other methods, because pretty much you know if your employees or members got the message or not. But you can always survey your members or employees to see, did they read the newsletter, did they attend the event, and if so, what was their opinion of it? Well, that's it for internal. Now, be sure and read the cases in your book and the extra cases that I have put on Blackboard for you. And we'll meet again next lesson.